Here, our new heroine is Princess Louise Amelia, the Belgian daughter of the cruel and promiscuous King Leopold II of Belgium. A daughter completely unnecessary, because all daughters from a legitimate wife of the king frankly perceived as a slag and a burden. And so, having received a very harsh, one might say, Spartan upbringing, and a very mediocre education in the ancestral home, Louise turned into a bride. She was attractive in appearance, here do not be skeptical, there were other canons of beauty. In addition, she was compared with other princesses in marriage, not with actresses, and her father had a reputation for fabulously wealthy men. Therefore, there was no shortage of suitors, since the maiden was 14 years old. However, her husband was chosen completely different from her status. Probably, Daddy the King had some political reasoning on this matter, but we look through the eyes of ordinary people. It is interesting that decisions on marriage were made exclusively by relatives of the future spouses, completely bypassing the interested parties themselves. Princess Louise's opinion was of no concern to anyone at all. As a result, she married her cousin on one side and a third cousin on the other, Prince Ferdinand Felipe Maria Augustus Raphael of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. The engagement took place in 1874, and the wedding took place in 1875. Louise before the wedding saw the future spouse once, a glimpse, and his candidacy proved not unpleasant. She dreamed of a romantic marriage, but the first wedding night turned out to be a real nightmare for her. No one had ever warned her about what might happen after the wedding. It was believed that nature itself would decide everything at the right moment. However, the groom showed indecency, resorting to violence and cruelty. For the girl, married life began a strong shock, and her attitude to her husband became far from ideal. The newlywed had to be searched all over the park, and her mother then spent a long time soothing, hugging and explaining to her the duties of a wife, trying to catch up. The explanations didn't help much for a long time after that. Her husband ordered strong wines into the bedroom every night and pre-drank his wife. Then he tried to liberate her, showing pictures in Japanese prints of certain content, but this only further pushed away from himself. They nevertheless managed to give birth to a daughter and a son, but there was never peace in their union from the beginning. That's not to say that Louise had a problem with the other men. Not at all. Soon she began to lead a brilliant social life, attending balls and traveling all over Europe with her husband. The presence of her husband did not prevent her from having affairs with other gentlemen. She drew her husband's money, shocking the European courts with her free-spirited behavior. She was often considered a frivolous person. Louise's character proved to be quite poisonous. Her shrewdness and sharp tongue allowed her to easily put in place those who dared to make her remarks. Her friend and object of veneration was, by the way, the Austro-Hungarian heir Prince Rudolph, the husband of her sister. She sincerely admired him. He was more than handsome, he was seductive. Of medium height and very slender, he was, despite appearing very delicate, very sturdy. His thoroughbredity was obvious, and looking at him one couldn't help but think of a thoroughbred horse. He was sensitive and often changed moods, at one moment was kind, the next angry, and at the third moment again was able to become the most charming person. The relationship with my spouse took on a character of apparent hostility. Children did not cause me maternal feelings. Since 1887, they were safely transferred to the education of professional educators, and I almost did not give them attention. But in her life began to appear no longer a fleeting affair, but permanent, stable connections. First, in 1883, it was the military attaché of her husband, a brilliant officer Baron Daniel Dabling de Gissenberg. The relatives tried to influence but without success. Their connection was only interrupted in 1888 by the Baron's sudden death. Then her husband appointed a new attaché to fill the vacant place, Baron Nikolaus Dery de Jabahis, a young German aristocrat, an excellent horseman and hunter, and to him also inherited the sympathy of the princess. But in 1895 she met a lancer, Oberleutnant and Croatian by birth, Geza von Matičić, and he in her eyes overshadowed everyone else. The young lancer shone with his brilliance, 9 years younger than Louise, and 23 years younger than her hated husband. To catch up with the lancer in every respect was simply impossible for her husband. Louise first noticed Matičić in society, and then began to appear in the same places to enjoy his presence at least from afar. Soon their affair became known throughout Europe. Louise felt considerable pressure from both her family and the emperor. Influenced by the emperor, she was summoned, severely criticized, and temporarily suspended from her favorite Viennese balls. Louise, meanwhile, had carefree fun with her love, traveled and incurred enormous monstrous debts. She believed that daddy would die sooner or later, she and her sisters would inherit his grandiose fortune, and she would pay it off. In fact, daddy left his daughters nothing at all. As a matter of principle. And the debts, in the near future, paid by her husband, but the money was not enough, and, from personal funds, on the nobility of his sole emperor Franz Joseph. Her papa did not give a penny. Meanwhile, the capitals greatly colored Louise in the eyes of Geza. He liked to live large. However, all this tangle of debts unwound a little later. At that time, under pressure from the emperor, Louise's husband, obese old man Philip, challenged to a duel seducer of her heart. All because his wife's behavior was so defiant that the husband was ashamed to raise his eyes in front of the entire European aristocracy. He had to try to restore his reputation somehow. Philip predictably did not hit his opponent in the duel, but the brave lancer shot him in the arm. All European newspapers made a serial out of this story, telling first about the duel, and then, every day, informing readers how things are going with the prince's hand, whether it will fall off or not. It did. In 1898, Louise, through the joint efforts of creditors, her husband, relatives and the emperor, managed to pin down, and she was offered a choice to return to her husband or go to the madhouse. And she once again dishonored Philip by choosing the madhouse. She was locked up in this nice little house in Saxony. This is one of the buildings of the asylum, and she spent time there from 1899 to 1904. At that time they started to deal with the lancer. He was accused of falsifying financial documents. Geza was put on trial, sentenced to 6 years in prison, and stripped of his noble status, and therefore his title of count. He spent 4 years in prison, after which he was released, but he did not forget about Louise. Geza published his Memoirs of their love, in which he recounted how his beloved was cruelly imprisoned in a mental hospital. A few words about Geza's early release from prison. A young married woman fell in love with him, who had read their story in the newspapers and wanted to be close to the man for whom the other woman had made such sacrifices. She got a job at the prison where Geza was being held, and yes, became another victim of his bloody charm. She had a son with him in 1900, by the way. And it was she who helped him to secure his release, involving lawyers, and it was she who helped him, still in prison, to write articles in the newspapers in defense of Louise. In general, Geza was released early, attracted attention to Louise with his book, and then organized her escape from this very mental hospital. And he was helped by the same young woman in love with him, whose name was Maria Steger. And then they began to live together, traveling through Europe and hiding from persecution. Louise in 1905 was examined by forensic doctors in Paris, and they found her completely sane, and in 1906, she obtained a divorce from her husband. She had long demanded it, but she was not allowed. Everyone turned away from her, even her own children. She herself did not particularly complain about them. Until 1907, the family alliance included Maria, but after that date she was replaced by one of Louise's maids of honor. They lived as a threesome, and this arrangement was characteristic even of Geza's mother, who had long accompanied her first and potential second husbands. It became a peculiar family trait. Until 1916 they led a happy life and had no particular financial difficulties, as Geza received an inheritance from his stepfather, a wealthy Croatian count. After that, however, everything collapsed. Funds and citizenship were lost. They wandered the world, facing poverty. Geza passed away first, followed a year later by Louisa. She was not provided for by her relatives. Instead, they mourned her loss for months.